This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin. We'll be talking every week about books and ideas and things that have caught our attention. Our guest this week is Jonathan Spyer. He's a longtime journalist covering the Middle East. He's currently a Middle East analyst, author and journalist, of course, specializing in the areas of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and the broader issues of regional strategy. He is the director of the Rubin Center at the Interdisciplinary Center of Herzliya and a fellow at the Middle East Forum. His new book, Days of the Fall, A Reporter's Journey in the Syria and Iraq Wars, has just been published in English by Routledge. Jonathan Spyer, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I think the biggest question that overshadows the carnage in Syria is, what is the alternative to Assad? What are people fighting for? Is there an alternative? And your book is, very different in a way because you were really there on the ground long before, years before, as you put it, and you were able to see the evolution of so many fragmented parts of this opposition in the phase of the revolution. Who are they? They're a combination of savvy seculars, young Islamicists, Salafis, soldiers defecting from Assad's armies. Do they have anything in common, and is there a potential alternative?
Yeah, I think factually speaking, since September 2015, there has been no realistic chance of the Assad regime being toppled. And that's for a very specific reason, which is that once you have Russian air power entering the scene, which happened, we can even date it September 30th, 2015, when Russian aircraft first appear over the skies of Syria, that effectively ends any possibility of the military overthrow of the Assad regime. By the way, the reason the Russians intervened at that time was because there was then a very real possibility of the rebellion breaking through into Latakia province in the west, and that could well have been game over for the regime. Once the Russians are there, there's no longer any realistic chance of the regime being overthrown. But in terms of the nature of the insurgency against the regime, or revolution against the regime, it had already, by summer of 2015, gone through a whole number of metamorphoses over the course of the previous 4 years. That's to say, it had gone from being initially a combination of urban civil society opposition to the regime with rural, largely Sunni Muslim Arab armed opposition. It had gone from that to being basically an insurgency dominated by Sunni political Islam. By the summer of 2015, the thing that had a chance of winning, had the Russians not intervened, was in essence a Sunni Islamist insurgency supported by Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the Turks. So
you're saying this was no longer about fragmented groups competing for power afterwards. This was essentially one group that had dominated by that time.
Yeah, there was still, a whole alphabet soup of armed rebel groupings, each one with a more heroic name than the next, some of them very tiny and based on just on neighborhoods or villages, and others much larger. But by the summer of 2015, and the reason why the rebels began to do well then was because you had a kind of crystallization of a relatively united force center of the uprising, at least in the north of the country, which was a thing called Jaish al-Fatah. And this was a coming together of large Islamist military groups. There had been a kind of survival of the fittest thing in the country prior to that, where the larger ones had kind of consumed a lot of the smaller ones and thus grown bigger. They came together at that point, supported by Saudis, Qataris and Turks, and that was their best shot for defeating the regime. It didn't happen because of the entry of the Russians then tipped the balance.
So it's been just 2 years since the watershed, the appearance of the Russians in the Syrian arena. Can we talk seriously about the rebels being defeated? Is that something that we're about to see at any moment now?
It's a very realistic possibility of the armed rebellion being eclipsed. Having said, it certainly can no longer win. This is absolutely clear. It's a possibility of them being eclipsed. The issue here to consider is, what does Russia want? There are those analysts who, in my view, mistakenly characterize the current situation as the kind of resurgence of the Assad state, the resurgence of the old Syrian state. I may be being a little bit unkind, but to say that I think some of those analysts are people who sort of made careers out of studying the Assad state. So whilst they would never declare themselves supporters of it, they kind of miss it a little bit, and they're kind of maybe happy that they think it's now coming back.
So they mean the antebellum status
Exactly. So I think that's a mischaracterization of what's going on, because actually the forces that have eclipsed the rebellion and may well be on the way to defeating it is not the Assad forces themselves. It's largely Iranian-supported forces on the ground, the Russians in the air, and then Iranian and Russian financial and diplomatic support. It's not Assad who saved himself, it's his friends who've saved him.
Well, that makes it sound like a lot like Syria itself, the former Syria. The Assad regime Syria is a sort of failed state, and that we have outside powers completely ruling. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's much closer to the reality than the notion of the state, in resurgence, because if you look at the realities on the ground, and this is where I think being on the ground comes into being of interest here. I mean, I was in Damascus in April, and you note when you're sort of there, stuff that you can only really see close up, the absolute impunity with which Russian personnel behave in Damascus, that they're basically untouchable by the forces so-called of law of the Assad regime, firstly. And secondly, the way in which in vital parts of the city, the old city of Damascus, for example, these are guarded closely, not by the Syrian Arab army, but rather by the thing called National Defense Force. That's to say, the kind of Basij-type paramilitary group that the Iranians created back in 2013, that Qasem Soleimani created back in 2013. So these little indications show you just the extent to which the state is kind of not really, in lots of quite significant ways, is kind of not really there.
Okay, let's talk about your book more specifically, which is a personal account of your years of covering that conflict. And I think that this is really what it stands out for. Unlike other analysts, you don't sit in your cushy Washington office and reading all sorts of reports and news reports.
But no judgment.
No, but this is, you are an analyst with boots on the ground, no pun intended. And what do you think really is the added value of that type of Middle East analysis, of war reporting, but not so much as a journalist, more as an analyst/academic?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of factors. Firstly, as I said, I think that it can give you insight into developing processes that just take a while before you're going to become aware of them from the outside. That's to say, if you're not there on the ground, you're basically dependent on the news media as first responders, and then you're dependent on the news media being pretty good and pretty intrepid and managing to actually get that stuff. Now, sometimes that does happen. For example, with the story of Assad's use of chemical weapons, that was, there are examples, quite classic examples, I think, of real journalism done by the French Le Monde and then the British Times newspaper. There's great stuff. But there's also lots of stories that have been missed. Sometimes I think the stories are missed also because the reporters, by their nature, are not necessarily people who actually know the region they're operating in all that well, because they're people whose job is news reporting and they do it all over the world, and they get sort of sent then into Syria or Iraq or wherever else. I think the advantage of having people who, are also kind of regional specialists with some, allegedly or hopefully at least, some knowledge of the region they're covering, but who also are going in and doing sort of first responder reporting, is that they're able to see what's important and what's not, and sometimes sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So I think that's one way that makes the news coverage better, and also, of course, gives insights to the analyst who's doing it.
Can you give us a concrete example of like a process that you saw in an incipient stage and later became dominant?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, what I said before about the weakness or near invisibility in lots of ways of the Assad regime in its supposed stronghold in Damascus shows us the way that the balance of power to some degree between the various sides composing the regime side, so to speak. But there's more concrete examples I could bring from my years of reporting. For example, the fact that we were the first people actually to break the news of ISIS use of chemical weapons. That's something which, I was really, I think I may be able to claim here, the first person to write about that back in 2015. And that was precisely because, having built up very good relations with the Kurdish fighters and activists in the Kobani area, they decided to release the pictures they had of that usage to me. And so I was able to then release it to the world. That's something that, is important, I think, and it's something which you couldn't possibly have got to had I not sort of built up those relations in years preceding.
How long did it take to build up these relations? Take us through the process of establishing this relations of confidence.
Sure. Well, okay, so this is an interesting question. So I first entered the newly emergent at that time Kurdish-controlled part of northeast Syria in early 2013. Again, I don't think I was the first journalist to do it. One of the first to go in there at a time when the Syrian Kurds, it's difficult to exaggerate the extent to which the Syrian Kurds specifically have been sort of cut off from the world prior to the revolution, prior to the events breaking out in 2011. Many of them, these people don't have Syrian citizenship, so they couldn't get passports. So they were literally imprisoned in northeast Syria. Many of them had never met a foreigner before, never mind a foreign journalist. So it was really sort of virgin soil that people were operating on. And, through doing that stuff, through writing stories that they then were shown, that they then liked and so on, so friendships kind of developed. Again, in the Kobani Enclave I first entered in 2014, or maybe in late 2013, and Kobani was very difficult to enter. We had to enter it illegally, so to speak, across the Turkish border. Few people did that. The people who did it, the Kurds there, very much appreciated.
Kobani being the Kurdish border town, very close to the Turkish border.
Correct, yeah. And there was an enclave there which at that time was cut off from the bigger Kurdish enclave further east. They're now joined up. That time they were cut off. So the only way you could do it, you couldn't enter from Iraqi Kurdistan. You had to enter from Turkey. And that was something which wasn't all that easy to do. So people who did it were very much appreciated by the Kurds. And I think it was that more than perhaps anything else, that when it came time for releasing the stuff about the CW, they were like, well, that guy was sort of there when few other people were, when it wasn't that easy to access. Yeah, we should put it out to
We
him.
have to ask you about the difficulty of doing this. I mean, you went at a time when journalists were being kidnapped and killed and beheaded.
Yeah.
You made these crossings at very, very touchy moments. You even admit to a little bit of fear at one point. But you've gone back so many times since. What does one do about, A, the actual difficulty of doing it, and how do you deal with the complications and the fear?
I think you have to be, very careful and lucky and quite savvy as well. I think you have to know when to take calculated risks and also when not to. Many journalists began to cross that line into Syria in early 2012, and I was one of them. There were many others. And most of us also knew when to stop doing that. In early 2012, and actually right the way through most of 2012, there weren't kidnappings. The kidnappings began at the end of 2012. And, a lot of savvy people knew at what moment to stop doing that. I think I was one of those people. I said the last time I crossed the border illegally into rebel-controlled Syria was in northwest Syria. Was in summer of 2012 into Aleppo city. And once that summer was over, I stopped doing it. And
what
many
was
others
the turning
did
point?
too. We just began to note the presence of some very dangerous Salafi organizations emerging among the rebellion, specifically Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar Sham at that stage. I saw those guys actually when I was in Aleppo city in August of 2012 on one of the main checkpoints into rebel-controlled eastern Aleppo. Saw the look of them. They were dressed like Afghans. I immediately, again, partly going back to what Gilad asked earlier on, because of knowing the region a bit and knowing who looks like who, I was like, I don't know, if those guys are going to be around, we've been in this movie before, we remember in the Iraqi insurgency when kidnappings begun, it was clear what was about to happen, and I stopped going at that stage, and many others stopped as well. Others didn't, and it was those people, I think, who then suffered, in some cases, personal, terrible events.
But even regardless of the kidnappings and the radical Sunni rebels, you, unlike other Western journalists and visitors, are not only Western, you're also Jewish, and you're Israeli. You have an Israeli passport,
right.
And it's, as you write in the book, just a quick Google search would reveal that you are indeed Israeli and based in Israel. That was calling for trouble, wasn't it? Didn't you feel like you were pushing your luck?
Yeah, I think there's a phrase which my friend and colleague Eran Lehrman uses, which is that we don't discuss sources and methods, right? So I'm allowed to be a bit coy at this point. Yeah, there are ways to be a little bit careful about that and at least lessen and minimize the risks, and I do take some of those ways into account.
Well, you reveal some of them in your book, right? Growing the beard a little bit, looking a little bit Middle Eastern.
This is true, yeah, although these are the easier ways of doing it. So forgetting to show for a few days is important too. But look, there is, of course, an element of calculated risk in this. I don't think I ever did anything, phenomenally stupid. But having said that, perhaps other people looking at it would sort of do the balance differently. At the end of the day, I think we all agree that, covering this stuff is of some significance. It is important. There are times when you are really, I think, doing, journalism and Middle East analysis as it should be done, really in its purest form. There are also times when, for example, in Aleppo, I write about it in the book, when I witnessed a very obvious and terrible war crime, which was the deliberate bombing by Assad's air force of the Dar al-Shifa hospital. Now, of course, in the Syrian context, it's almost become banal. This stuff's happening every day. Nevertheless, I still felt it to be important to be the only journalistic witness there and then able to write about it afterwards for a US paper. So, this stuff is of significance, and I think you sort of balance the elements of risk involved with, hopefully, the significance of some of what you're doing.
I want to talk about some of the conversations that you had with people in the beginning, because it's interesting. I mean, one person said, you had a young Salafi early in the uprising who said, we're totally outpowered, but I give it a month and we'll win. And then other people said, oh, this is going to go badly. Now that you're writing this book 5 years later and you know the end of the movie, or at least where we think things are going, did you have any premonitions then about which way it was going to go, given your sort of background, deeper knowledge of the region?
Yeah, those phrases and those conversations came out of, quite a euphoric moment in the rebellion, the very early stage. That was in Binesh in Idlib province in February 2012. And there was really a kind of, euphoric sort of revolutionary atmosphere, I would say, in northwest Syria at that time, because this had been a sort of sorely oppressed and quite ignored population who suddenly had this, experience of the regime departing and then being able to sort of do and say what they wanted for the first time ever in their lives, sort of thing. And those conversations came out of that, the sense of quite unrealistic optimism, which is described there, I think came out of that. I think most observers, or many observers, and myself included, even then, knew it would take a lot longer than a month for Assad to fall. Actually, now I recall Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak is not to be nominated. He thought they would fall in 3 weeks, but some of us realised that wasn't going to happen. At the same time, I was certainly among those people and many others that thought the rebellion had a real fighting chance at that stage. It's hard maybe to remember the feelings of the time. It's 2012. The Arab Spring was still on. Authoritarian regimes of long standing had fallen one after another in the year or two preceding. There was a sense that, Assad's kind of next in line. There is some kind of energy sweeping the Arab world, and this stuff is happening. I was never that optimistic about the chances of building something great afterwards, but I did think that the regime had a good chance of falling. And again, I do think it would have fallen had it not been for the very great efforts made by its friends.
The setting of your book, as you said, the wars in Syria and Iraq, and now that we mentioned the broader regional context, do you think that we're really talking about two facets of the same phenomenon, the war in Syria and the war in Iraq, or can they be treated separately as two phenomena with, that are highly interlinked?
And similar consequences.
Yeah, I do think that in terms, if we think of the war in Iraq, that at least that I'm writing about in the book, which is really the war that results from the entry of ISIS back into Iraq in the summer of 2014, then in this sense they are one sort of complex, so to speak, because the one is clearly a direct byproduct of the other. Of course, Iraq and Syria, have different histories and differ in significant ways as societies, not only as polities. But having said that, I think the wars did result from a single beginning, and I do think also that a lot of the issues facing these two areas are quite similar in terms of, both of them have faced either the destruction of or the contraction of a very, very brutal dictatorial regime, and then the societal results of that, the fragmentation of the society along sectarian lines to some degree, the permeation of the area by foreign powers as a result of the kind of collapse or contraction of the state. These are all very similar. The other thing to bear in mind is that there are factors, ISIS is one, Iran is another, the Kurds a little bit are a third, who operate as if it was one space. Who sort of treat Iraq and Syria as if it was a single space. And
but for you as a reporter on the ground, did it feel different to report from Iraq and Syria? I mean, did reporting from two separate areas in Syria feel different than reporting from one area in Syria, a border area in Syria and a border area in Iraq? Yeah,
for me, certainly, yes. I mean, these are different societies. The people look different. The people speak differently. The architecture looks different. These are different areas. Syria is, as somebody who's sort of lived in Israel for many years, Syria, large parts of Syria are surprisingly recognizable. That's to say, when you go to Syria, you realize this notion of the Levant, or Bilad Asham in Arabic or whatever, it's a real thing. There are real cultural closenesses and similarities in terms of architecture, in terms of physical appearance of the, even of the people, you could say, but certainly of the geographical area and so on, between Syria and Lebanon and Israel and the Palestinian territories. These are similar. And Iraq is profoundly different, and you have that sense of profound difference. The Arabic also, of course, is profound. If you learn Levantine Arabic, you realize very rapidly when you're in Baghdad, it's not going to get you very far.
What about the functionality of those two states? I mean, is there a competition here between which is most dysfunctional? Where does Iraq rate relative to where Syria is now?
Very different, I would say, because in Iraq, obviously the regime was destroyed from the outside by the Americans and their allies, and then something else was created in its place. And to some degree, that something else, just about functions. I mean, it's deeply dysfunctional, but there has not yet been, since the American departure, which was only 6 years ago, there's not yet been a home-generated civil war in Iraq. ISIS came in, went into Syria, and then erupted back from Syria. There may well still be we may well be, ahead of a real civil war in Iraq between the Kurds and the Shia militias.
Well, this is my next question, yeah.
But in Syria there was. So Syria's at a different stage of collapse or fragmentation in that respect.
I mean, you also report very closely on your contacts with the Kurds, of course, in both areas, in Iraq and in Syria. And we all know that, famously they've been on the front line of the fight against ISIS. And, we just had a referendum on independence. And I think nobody's clear on what's going to happen. But what do you think? I mean, given what you've just said about the marginalization and alienation of the Syrian Kurds, the frontline fighting of the Iraqi Kurds, and the levels of sort of dysfunctionality, certainly of Syria and sort of functionality of Iraq, do you think they have a good chance of declaring independence and succeeding in any way in being independent? Or are we looking at a potential civil war?
Well, both can be true, of course. I think that, if the Kurds mean to, in Iraq, if the KRG means to really push towards independence, not in the next 6 months, but over the next 2, 3, 4 years, then there is likely to be violence as a result of that, specifically in the Kirkuk area because of the oil wealth in Kirkuk and because of the presence of Shia population there, which the Shia militias will be keen to try to keep the Kurds away from. So, I think the real chance of independence, if they choose to push in that direction, I think they're unlikely to get to that point without some real violence along the way. That's, I'm afraid, the case. With regard to the Syrian Kurds, it's very different. I mean, as we all know, the KRG is a very established space. It's been around, in essence, since the early 90s. So it looks like a very developed, quasi-independent space. Syrian Kurdistan is very new. It's very provisional. In a certain sense, the questions surrounding Syrian Kurdistan, unlike Iraqi Kurdistan, are will it actually survive as an autonomous enclave? Long, long way away from independence. They can't even think in those terms. And also, of course, there's an ideological difference. The PKK franchise that runs northeast Syria claimed to not be interested in independence and claimed to want to have a sort of federal autonomy in northeast Syria.
I want to get back to one of the interesting points that I think really emerges from your book because you're on the ground seeing so many of these terrible things happening. And you raise this question, to what extent does exposing this stuff actually make a difference? And then you're critical of, Western lack of intervention at certain points, or you hint at that. And I wonder, what you think, actually, first of all, if you could expand on your criticism of specifically American and Western intervention, lack of intervention. Would you pin it primarily on Obama, or would you say this is a problem of generally the Western powers? And then I am interested to hear more about what you think, as a journalist on the ground, should be done differently. Yeah,
I wouldn't pin it only on Obama. I think there's two reasons to not do that. First of all, if we think about the issue of use of chemical weapons and then the non-imposition of the red line, it should be remembered that the British Parliament also voted against it. That was one of the reasons why Obama was able to say we're not doing it because our British allies aren't coming with us. So it's certainly not only about Obama. I think in a broader sense, it's also not only about Obama in the sense that Obama is to some degree a product of the very great fatigue and lack of willingness or lack of desire on the part of the American public to get involved in a third costly Middle East adventure after Afghanistan and Iraq, neither of which, of course, were ringing successes. I think we can probably agree. So it's all quite understandable. Having said that, from looking at it from the other direction, from sort of observing closely the Syrian insurgency in early 2012, there is to some degree, I think, an opportunity that was lost in the sense there was a moment in the insurgency before it became conclusively taken over by Islamists and Salafis when it really wasn't an Islamist uprising. And if at that point the West had chosen to get behind it and by so doing, turned back or to some degree frustrated the ambitions of Western rivals and enemies who now are doing very well in that space, the Iranians and the Russians, that would, I think, have been possible. Now, it wouldn't have produced a democracy, I don't think. Essentially, it would have been something like finding a Syrian version of General Khalifa Haftar of Libya or General Sisi, Field Marshal Sisi of Egypt. That's what it really would have been. But it could have produced something different to what I think is currently going down. So, yes, I think that more could have been done. You also asked about what, or from a journalistic point of view, what that sort of felt like and so on. Yeah, it was frustrating. Also in the 2012 context, I think also in the context of Sinjar and the ISIS entry into the region and the sort of threat of genocide of non-Muslim minority groups in Iraq and northern Syria at that time. Of course, having said that, at the end of the day, in that specific context, actually the West did intervene at a certain point. The role of American air power, well, at least when the immediate crisis had passed on Sinjar Mountain, has been very important. It was the Kurds who broke the siege of Sinjar, and it's important to remember, the PKK specifically, actually. But nevertheless, it was American air power afterwards that then drove ISIS back and is now, about to put ISIS out of existence. So it's a mixed picture as well.
My feeling reading the book was that despite the really sordid set setting, the sordid context of, a bloody war, it had some sort of optimistic undertones to it. By that I mean that I saw it as an attempt to perhaps demystify the conflict a bit, because you describe all these people, all these players, as human beings, very human, with all their quirks and foibles. Sometimes they're innocent, sometimes they're childish even. Was that like something that you were trying to do? Was that like a declared purpose for you, or is it just a byproduct?
Yeah, I think that it was, in the sense that just, I was aware of just a massive amount of human experience and exposure to people in all their, varying forms in that space. And it is fascinating, and I think is also important to try to reflect on the different personalities that you're coming across, on the way those different people are trying to cope with quite extraordinary situations. And often I think it's good to present it from the point of view of presenting personalities, because it enables people to realise that these weren't sort of strange other creatures to whom these terrible events happened. They were actually people who are, entirely recognisable to ourselves and very, very similar to ourselves. And it might sound like a banal and obvious, but actually the thing is that's, I think, often not presented quite as much as it should be. So I do think it's important to try to do that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you even talk about, the meeting ISIS figures, and are they monsters? You have this word that sort of comes up. Should we be humanizing them? I mean, how do we look at these people?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to humanize them in the sense of then trying to sort of excuse any of the crimes committed by that organization.
No, I don't think anybody wants to excuse them.
Sure, but on any level to relativize those acts. Having said that, the fact of the matter is that these actually are human beings. They're not aliens. Cyborgs, right. So they are. It is in fact human beings. And, I do think there is something at least quite important in what I wanted to do by presenting those interviews, which is the following. There's been a great deal of media focus on the foreign fighters in ISIS, and in terms of the dramatic work that's been done already now, some of these dramas that have come out, the recent British drama by Peter Kosminski, and much of the journalistic coverage, and you could get the impression that ISIS mainly consisted of sort of, idealistic or lunatic foreign volunteers. The majority of ISIS fighters at every moment in Syria were Syrian Sunnis. This is really important. And when I interviewed the two ISIS people in Kilis in Turkey, these were guys from Azaz, Sunni Arab Syrians who came to ISIS through being involved in the rebellion against Assad. That's what lots and lots of the ISIS fighters were like, and their justification for getting involved with ISIS had nothing really to do with the caliphate or the desire for, I don't know what, for whatever. Their thing was, well, we were looking for people who could defend the Sunni interest in Syria, and these guys came along. They weren't corrupt, they were strong, we thought they could do it.
Even though in some places in the book you do write about, having picked up the London cadence here and there, there was, to a large extent, an international presence there almost throughout your experiences, right?
That's true. I mean, if I'm thinking about the examples in the book I give, I think there's a couple of times actually when it's Kurdish fighters who have various British or American accents, and it's quite odd because, of course, then you realise the reason is clear, because there was a big wave of Kurdish immigration to Britain or to the West in the late 80s, early 90s. Kids who would have been born, just when they would have been little kids then, grew up speaking these accents, but at the same time be, of course, deeply connected to the places their parents came from, and then that manifests itself. Look, it is a fascinating element, and I think it'll be written about much length in the future, the role of non-Middle Easterners, non-Syrians in the Syrian war, whether it's the ISIS volunteers or the foreign volunteers who went to fight with the Kurdish YPG, or, people among the rebels who'd spent time in London or in Western Europe, or indeed the curious group of Westerners who've attached themselves to the Assad regime and found in the Assad regime some curious thing in which to believe. And that's covered a little bit in the book as well. They're a fascinating group as well in all kinds of ways. So yes, these aspects are important.
I want to bring it back to our little corner of the world towards the end of this interview. There are a few moments where Israel comes up in very strange ways. Like one of the soldiers who had defected from Assad's army says, well, at first they told us we were going to engage with, Israeli military that had infiltrated. Then that turned out to be a ruse, and we were supposed to fire on our own civilians. And then on the other hand, you have your fixer who's like a great guy, but talking about how the Zionist media kind of controls everything.
And Assad being a Jewish dog.
Right. So, I mean, where is Israel in this picture? Is it the same old demon that it always was, or do we see Syrians and all, various parts of the opposition saying this has always been, a ruse of this fascist dictator whom we hate?
Yeah, it would be nice to say that was the case, and it might sound intuitive like it ought to be. I must say that in my experience, I've heard that very little among Syrian opposition. It's like this notion of, we were fed this line and we know it's not true. I personally have heard that little, and in fact, I must say that I've actually heard opposite type remarks that from various rebels I've spoken to quite a lot. And there's one of them in the book where a guy, it's in the chapter where I'm talking what I call the kind of twilight of the rebellion. It's in mid-2016, talking to a rebel commander in Turkey, in Gaziantep. And he goes into this whole long justification or explanation, as he would see it, of how Assad and Iran and Israel are all on the same side working against the Sunnis, and the fact that you can have Jewish synagogues in Tehran, but you can't open a Sunni mosque is the great piece of proof that he gives. So this
Maybe
notion,
he hadn't opened a newspaper lately.
You're right. Well, this notion that, anybody who I don't like is a Zionist and connected to Israel, which is so visible in much interaction in the Middle East, I'm afraid is present also in the Syrian war.
Even among the Kurds, because now we see all this, the Kurds claiming independence in northern Iraq, waving the Israeli flag.
And they haven't declared yet.
Yeah. Among the Kurds, much less so. If I can think of my own experience. In fact, among the Kurds, there is a real difference. You asked earlier on about the issue of being Jewish or Israel-connected journalist or whatever on the ground in Syria. The accounting of that, the considering of that is totally different among the Kurds than among the Arab rebels or, of course, the Arab pro-government side in Syria. You hear all kinds of pro-Israel things among the Kurds, and the whole attitude is just very different. It's very easy, actually, to be a Jewish or Israel-connected person among the Kurds, and that's true of Iraqi Kurds. It's also, in my experience, true of Syrian Kurds. So, yeah, it's a very different thing.
I'd love to end by asking if there's any hope for Syria, but I'm afraid of the answer.
I'm afraid, at least in the short term, what we're witnessing is the ongoing conflict between a very, very brutal regime and, I'm afraid, a relatively dysfunctional rebellion. If there is some place for optimism, I think it's in the northeast Syria, in the Kurdish-controlled areas. That, at least, is the most livable area, and by no means perfect, by no means ideal, but nevertheless the most livable area. But I'm afraid, for the most part, I think we're in for probably some form of conflict, smouldering conflict. For some time, people talk about the Syrian war winding down. 3,050 people were killed in Syria in September of 2017. It's the most bloody month of this year. So the conflict's by no means winding down yet, and I think it probably has a long way to run, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, I guess. Jonathan Spyer talking about his book, Days of the Fall, A Reporter's Journey in the Syria and Iraq Wars, which has just been published in English by Routledge Press.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you liked this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also visit our archive. There are more than 350 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and perhaps intrigued.
Or depressed.
Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.